Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I'm going to talk about the second section of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, chapters 5 through 10, about Jane's time at the Lowood School. This is part of a series of videos that started in celebration of June Eyre. I don't know if we should rename it July Eyre at this point, which I'm making alongside Steve Donahue, who's doing a read aloud of the novel. If you haven't seen my general introduction or either watched Steve's read aloud of these chapters, these specific chapters, which he completed a couple of days ago, or read the chapters on your own, you might want to do that first. At any rate, let's jump right into this little series of chapters, which starts with Jane's journey from Gateshead, where she lived with her aunt by marriage and her cousins, to her new abode, the Lowood School, where she spends several years, first as a student and then eventually as a teacher there. As this section starts, Bessie is helping Jane get up early one morning and prepare to leave Gateswood and start a new life at Lowood. Mrs. Reed doesn't even want to be awakened before 10-year-old Jane begins her coach ride alone across the countryside. We might think about the adventure narratives that Jane loved to read in the window seat, such as Gulliver's Travels. After a sweet parting from Bessie, Jane proceeds just as those adventure heroes did, by heading off to unknown lands. In these early pages, she recounts an unpleasant conversation with Mrs. Reed the night before. In Steve's discussion of the chapter, he mentions that he doesn't fully trust the narrator and her account of this interaction, something he's pointed out in other situations too, I think. When I first heard him say that, my initial thought was that it was a strange comment when applied to fiction. The story is not supposed to be truth, although scholars have spent a lot of time drawing parallels between this novel and all the other novels by the Brontes and their personal biographies. What does it mean not to trust the truth of a novel? Maybe especially a novel that is not completely a novel of realism. In a Gothic novel, or maybe a sensationalist novel, we might experience supernatural events or things that were anything but realism, really dramatic, larger-than-life scenarios. And this particular novel falls somewhere in between realism, the Gothic, and sensationalist literature. Still, as I've thought about the comment a bit longer, I think Steve was onto something. Novels need to express something that feels true within the context of the novel. Do readers hear what Jane is saying about her childhood experiences and think they seem too dramatic or maybe too self-pitying to be believed? For me, while I never assume she's telling the whole story, I tend to take her descriptions not at face value as much as an articulation of how she felt at the time. If Mrs. Reed were telling the story, I'm sure it would be very different. And while I certainly wouldn't trust her as a narrator either, it might be quite interesting to get a hint about what she was feeling or what she wanted other people to, quote, understand about the happenings with Jane at Gateshead. But to go back to Jane, if we question the truth of her narration in this novel, we might call her an unreliable narrator, a term that still leaves us wondering if she's just seeing her side of the story, or at least just telling her side of the story, or if she is deliberately and consciously lying to us. I absolutely do not think the author Charlotte Bronte wanted us to even consider that latter question. That Jane is a truth teller, not necessarily telling the truth, at least in this work of fiction, but telling honestly what she felt was true, is incredibly important in the novel. Readers develop a real relationship with the character, and we are meant to fundamentally trust her, at least in most ways, to be honest with us, even when we see her as flawed or scarred by her past. We watch her grow over time as she confronts some of her acknowledged flaws, And true dishonesty is not supposed to be one of them, although a tendency to interpret the world only from her own perspective certainly is. Another way we might question the full, quote, truth of this fictional narration is by thinking about the differences between the character of young Jane and the narrator, or older Jane. As I talked about very briefly last time, the narrator is an adult Jane looking back on her life from the point of view after the events of almost the entirety of the novel. Jane is not sharing the events of each scene in the moment when they happened, which might give us a very fresh and visceral view, shaped perhaps by her trauma and her anger, by her limited understanding, etc. But telling it from later shapes it in different ways. First, the adult Jane might not be able to remember details from her childhood as well as more recent events. Could you recount even the most important conversations you had when you were 10 years old with this kind of detail? I certainly couldn't, even after reading through my childhood diaries, which were mostly filled with details of what was served in the grammar school cafeteria. And of course, even if she were to remember exactly what she heard all those years ago, she wouldn't necessarily have understood all of what Mrs. Reed and the others intended. And then there's another issue. Jane, the narrator, already knows exactly what's going to happen throughout her fictive life, and that allows her to determine what she wants to tell us. She's specifically shaping what she shares with us. She's telling us only the parts that she looks back on as relevant to the larger story she's telling. For those of us who are rereading this story for the umpteenth time, we might not really notice this aspect anymore since we know the narrative arc of the whole novel. But the way Jane and Charlotte are shaping the narrative to lead us towards future events is how this particular narration works. I think in my first video in this series, I mentioned that the casting of novels as fictional autobiographies wasn't new when Jane Eyre appeared. It is one of the first fictional autobiographies that is female-focused, but there's another difference. One of the most famous novels of this type is Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, a novel which repeats daily events, etc., more as if it were a log of events. Jane, on the other hand, has a very specific story she wants to tell, and she's setting it up with the relevant events from her past, not the whole story. We learn about what Jane thinks shaped her early in her life, not really the full history of life at Gateswood or Lowood. So what I'm seeing here is that Charlotte Bronte lets go a little of the tradition in a lot of early novels to use ideas about verisimilitude. In addition to focusing only on what seems emotionally relevant, she also depends far less on the relatively common practice by early British authors of inserting long passages from letters or journals, which to me seems like yet another way to try to appear as if the novels were real life. Actually, Charlotte's sister Anne uses this latter technique extensively in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But there's something about Jane Eyre's direct voice, her direct telling of the story, that I find just tremendously effective and involving. We sometimes see Jane telling her story to other characters. She tells her friend Helen all about Miss Reed's unkind and unjust treatment as she tries to understand Helen's ideas about forgiveness. Helen also asks her to consider that Mrs. Reed's intentions might have been something other than pure cruelty, as Jane had always believed. When I talked earlier in this video about Jane's potential misunderstanding of Miss Reed, this was the section I was thinking about. I'm not sure that Helen was any more right than Jane, but even in the same section, the adult Jane makes sure that we, the readers, realize the possibility that childish Jane might not have seen the full picture. Later in the video, I'll come back to Helen's religious mindset, and we'll be coming back to the theme of forgiveness again, and then again even more in future videos. In another example of Jane's telling her story as a young person, after Brocklehurst publicly calls her a liar, Jane tells her version of the story to Miss Temple in an effort to clear her name. Miss Temple listens carefully, and she not only assures Jane that she believes her, but gets it corroborated by Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary who intervened after Jane's spell in the Red Room. The telling of the story has a lot of power here. In one of the early chapters in this section, Jane, the narrator, addresses us as reader for the first time, I think. She's telling us the story. I should check to see if other early authors had done that kind of thing. Let me know if any of you know anything about that. Basically, in ways we'll see echoes all the way to the final chapter, Jane is telling the story directly to the reader, directly to us. She explicitly creates a relationship with us, acknowledging that we are essential to this book. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons this book resonates with its readers so quickly, and why our relationship with Jane Eyre lasts far longer than our reading of the book. She becomes our friend. Well, speaking of friends, I want to talk in just a bit more detail about a few of the people to whom Jane grows especially close while she's at Lowood. But let's not forget her main enemy at the school too, Mr. Brocklehurst. Soon after Jane arrives at Lowood, she sees carved into the stone above the front door the words Lowood Institution, with a quote from the book of Matthew about doing good works. It confuses Jane. As she's trying to make sense of it, she spots a girl sitting nearby, quote, bent over a book, as Bronte writes, and coughing. The book was Rasselas by Samuel Johnson, a book basically about a character who leaves the innocence of Happy Valley and finds a real world full of sorrows. Eventually, he comes to the conclusion that learning to accept life's difficulties allows one to feel happiness, that happiness is a choice, in other words. And that is more or less the religious perspective that Helen holds too in a lot of ways, which we'll circle back around to in a minute. Ever the person attracted to books and readers, even if only less serious books at that point in her life, young Jane goes up to talk with Helen, a girl a little older than she is. And she asks about the name and the quote above the door. Helen explains that Lowood is a place for orphans, then meaning children who had lost either one or both parents. And while the families of those students paid a small amount, most was covered by philanthropists with donations to the school. In other words, as the narrator does not say explicitly, Mrs. Reed is refusing to spend many of her pennies on our Jane. Helen then describes the staff of the school, including the most excellent Miss Temple, who is regal and smart and kind. Jane has already had just enough experience with her to admire her, and that only grows through this section. Helen and Jane become closer as time goes by, and despite her frequent cough, Helen shares quite a bit of her religious or metaphysical thought with young Jane, a theology rooted in an effort to become a better person, a deep belief in the goodness of others, and an understanding that true forgiveness is good not only for the person who might have irritated you, but also for yourself. True happiness, she basically argues, comes from acceptance and from forgiveness. Occasionally, Helen is punished for slight infractions, and she believes the teachers punish her because they do not like her flaws. She doesn't see the punishments as cruelty, as Jane does. When Jane says she would not take the kind of punishments that Helen faced, Helen smiles and tells her she would probably do exactly the same thing that she had done. And when Jane does indeed face punishment, even though she was filled with a sense of injustice, she stood on the stool calmly, waiting for her time of punishment to end, just as Helen did. While she didn't accept that the punishment was just as Helen did, she was learning a different way of being in the world than just fighting. When so many of the students were ill with typhus, and Helen was very ill with consumption, as you might have known from that cough, The still healthy students were allowed a bit more freedom than usual to roam the surrounding lands. And during this period, we meet Jane's new friend, Mary Ann Wilson, who Jane enjoys partly because she was a wonderful storyteller, sort of like Bessie was. She brings Jane quite a bit of joy as they wander around in nature, in scenes that sometimes feel like they're borrowed from fairy tales. Last time I mentioned the big bad wolf nature of Brocklehurst, and here we get a reference to the little old man and little old woman in a house in the forest. We'll see more fairy tale allusions in the chapters to come. So I said that Mary Ann made Jane happy, and she did, but at the same time, she didn't hold quite the place in Jane's heart that Helen did, mostly because Helen made Jane think deeply about the kind of person she wanted to become. She offered her a way of seeing the world that Jane had not considered before, one that did not come naturally to Jane. But the interactions between the two put Jane on a path of considering how, as I think Steve said, she could be true to herself and live as an honest and free human. Let's think a bit more explicitly about what kind of faith she saw at Lowood and how it shaped her. First, we get the somewhat puritanical but also highly hypocritical faith of Mr. Brocklehurst. He says he believes the girls should experience deprivation and even suffering as a way to, quote, evince fortitude and learn to take up the cross of Jesus. One of the most horrifying moments in this section for me is when he visits the school and basically goes ballistic on the hair of the girls. He wants them to be self-denying, he says, not made delicate by special coddling. And he uses what I take as misogynist language, referring to the, quote, vile bodies of the girls and trying to make sure there is not a drop of vanity in their self-presentation. And sometimes it isn't vanity at all. It seems more like he's undone by their developing femininity and wants to squash any bit of sexuality that might be expressed, no matter how innocently. He is so horrified by the natural curls of one red-haired girl that he eventually calls for all of the girls' top knots to be cut off. My ambition is to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh, he says, more or less. Instead, they are to be dressed with shamefacedness and sobriety. Of course, as soon as he finished saying all of this, his own family enters, dressed in the latest fashions, including ostrich plumes and elaborately curled hairpieces. Young Jane tries unsuccessfully to avoid his wrath. It's quite clear in the narration that Jane sees all the hypocrisy and has no respect for Brocklehurst, but at the same time, his call for modesty in his pupils is one that is quite defining for Jane all the way through the book. She is not only small, but plain, and she continues to choose to be plain, as we'll see in future chapters. Is this a natural trait of hers, or does it come partly from the somewhat severe code at Lowood? Okay, the other major source of religious examples she sees at this point in the book is, of course, from Helen, as I mentioned. From her, Jane hears a very different kind of doctrine from Brocklehurst, one of forgiveness and generosity of spirit, rooted in her belief in an always loving God. I would argue that Helen did not convince Jane to believe her own specific religious interpretations, but she did inspire Jane to think about metaphysical ideas, really for the first time. And one lesson that Jane clearly took to heart is the commitment to forgiveness. Narrator Jane told us in the first section of the book that as an adult, she found a way to forgive Mrs. Reed. And we'll see that theme arise again. In his video, Steve referred to Jane as a purely pagan creation. I had not thought of it that way until he said it. Obviously, I'd recognized before that while she grew up with Bible stories, she didn't grow up with faith or ideas about formal Christian morality, etc. I had thought of her as effectively non-religious. But I think Steve's right that Jane's position, here while she is young, but even when she's an adult, who would certainly have called herself deeply Christian, is inherently something different than just non-religious. It's quite natural rather than doctrinaire. What she often seems to feel is a kind of divinity, or sometimes even magic maybe, in the world rather than separate from it. And she has a kind of intense personal morality that stems from somewhere other than formal theology. The place of Christianity in Jane's life is a key subject of some pretty intense debate by readers of this novel. And we'll get into that a lot more later in the book when we've seen a bit more of Jane's development over time. And we'll also talk a bit about how Jane Eyre's faith might have been shaped by Charlotte Bronte's beliefs as well. So let's talk about education for a minute before we wrap up. I mentioned in my last video that one of the things that especially excited Jane about the idea of going to school was the accomplishments of young students that she'd heard about from her family at Gateshead. Everything from learning to draw to gaining fluency in a foreign language, especially French. And despite the fact that Lowood was not the kind of prestigious educational situation that her cousins attended, she did indeed learn to draw and both read and speak French, among other things. I'm sure that some of the graduates of Lowood were able to find marriage partners who could support them. But a lot of the young women at Lowood knew that they were very likely to need to find employment to support themselves. Jane Eyre takes place at a time when the country was starting to experience the, quote, surplus woman crisis. And there were several reasons for the rise in the number of single women and the decline in the number of low-level jobs. Jobs declined partly because of the spread of mechanization. And when people did hire, they usually prioritized men. Also during this period, the possibilities and the demands of the British Empire took many men abroad for work, either on ships or in new colonies, etc. This is not my area of expertise, and if anyone wants to clarify this issue more in the comments, I'd be thrilled to learn more. At any rate, with the demographic change, combined with the girls' lack of financial protection by families in general, the young graduates of Lowood were often looking for work. Some certainly would have wound up as servants, but education might have offered a fair number of the better students the opportunity to become governesses. We'll talk a little bit more about that, maybe next time, about the complications of this role of governess. But it was often seen as higher status employment, even bearing those complications in mind. And to become a governess, a reasonable education, including some French and other attainments, was considered desirable, perhaps even necessary. But while Jane might have appreciated that her education provided her with skills that made her employable, employed by Lowood itself for a couple of years, that benefit was not the one that meant the most to Jane. Jane excelled in school and loved learning. She was proud of the work she had accomplished, and she was impressed by the learning of her peers, especially perhaps by the fact that Helen Burns was reading Virgil in the original Latin and translating it, presumably because of her father's tutelage rather than anything she learned at Lowood. Interestingly, Latin serves as a bit of a motif here. The fact that Helen reads at least a little Latin is echoed later on near the end of the section when the novel states that for 15 years Helen's grave did not have a headstone. Jane tells us that now it has a marble headstone engraved with the Latin word resurgam, meaning I shall rise again. Now, I thought I knew its etymology as Latin, but Steve's funny little comment, I guess a joke that I didn't understand about the word resurgam, made me question myself enough that I looked it up just to make sure. The OED confirmed that it indeed has that specific etymology and meaning, but it also pointed out that the carving of it on a tombstone happens in Thackeray's Vanity Fair. And also, and I love this, resurgam was the name of a later Victorian submarine. I shall rise again, indeed. In the case of Helen's tombstone, I think we can assume that the adult Jane herself, who's narrating this book, is the one who erected it on Helen's gravesite, recognizing how much Helen had added to her life and shaped her thinking in many ways. Readers sometimes say that Jane herself was, at least in some ways, a new rising of the aspects of Helen. And that is not totally untrue, even for those of us who don't think Jane really followed most of Helen's ideas. We'll talk more about that later in the book. Okay, one last little thing. In many novels before Jane Eyre and throughout the Victorian period, we see at least the vestiges of an episodic structure. Episodes often built around place. So far in this novel, we've had 2 episodes or sections at 2 places, Gateshead and Lowood, with their evocative names. Starting next time, we'll head to Thornfield, and we'll remain there a little bit longer, but we'll do some further traveling as well. My gut right now is that I'll next talk about the chunk of chapters from maybe 11 to 16 or thereabouts. Well, thank you for joining me today for this leg of our deep dive. See you again soon here on Hannah's Books.